Let's come to the fifth presentation of Hermetic America Future. And what we're looking at is a spiraling inquiry that has a double spiral motion, so that there is constantly a ever-shifting comparative tuning of our attention. This is an ancient wisdom technique, and it bears its signature all the way through for organic life in the form of the double helix of DNA. They do not go in parallel, but they go in a complementarity. As one spirals out, the other spirals in. And it is this complexity of harmonic that allows for a universal expansion of whatever has been established to further reaches of possibility. 2,000 years ago, this achieved a presentational form in ancient classical Alexandria in a series of dialogues called the Hermetica. Those Hermetica used as the basic approach that wisdom requires a transformational guidance, that those who have inherited from the previous wisdom guides were the ones who were under that aegis to pass it on, that wisdom learning was a gift, and that the gift of it was shareable, and that the original constellation of it was that the wisdom was initially meant 5,000 years ago only for the special king, only for the pharaoh. So that we find in ancient Egypt, 3000 BC, right away when the first wisdom teachings were made available in hieroglyphics, they're already complex and full-blown. The beginnings of dynastic Egypt, the first dynasty, with the first pharaoh, Narmer, you find that the instructor was the guide Thoth, the god of wisdom, the ibis-headed symbol guide, and it was his responsibility to make sure that the pristine ancient wisdom tradition at that time was delivered directly to the pharaoh so that he would not die and that his resurrection would be assured by being able to go through the 12 caverns of the netherworld, each one fronted by a gate and a keeper of the gate, and that one could only use a special sacred language to satisfy the keeper of that gate to open that gate and let the soul of the journey through the netherworld go on to the next gate, and that one had to have the 12 gates in a row, in a resonance, in a harmonic, and if one could do this, one could emerge after the 12th gate and rise on a new day with the sun. And that as Ra rose, establishing for the first time ever a new day, which was an element, a component of time, and that the day and its subdivisions of the hours were established fresh each day. They were literally pioneered out of an eternity that had no form, so that when it came into form cinched by an ability for language to satisfy the wickets of gates that one had to pass through so that they would not be entrapments. What entrapped one and stopped one and literally condemned one to remain where you had got to, unsatisfied forever, was that if the language was deceptive, if it was a lie, if it was not pristinely accurate and correct, it could not be heard by the keeper of that gate, and it would not open, and you would stay wherever you had gotten to forever, permanently. In the netherworld, you would never resurface. You would never be reborn. 3000 BC, but 1,000 years later, a whole millennium later, there came a very special individual around 2000 BC. His name was Abram, and later, after having a visionary capacity revealed to himself, he lengthened his name under vision to Abraham. And so from the beginnings of dynastic Egypt to Abraham is about 1,000 years. It's a millennium. And it's interesting because from Abraham to King David is another millennium, another 1,000 years. King David and his prized son, King Solomon. David passed on the kingship to Solomon in very peculiar circumstances in the early 900s, about 980s BC, ostensibly about 1000 BC. And from David and Solomon, it's another millennium to Jesus. And so Jesus represents in his incarnation a very esoteric time form. And the time form is what one finds in the New Testament immediately in the Gospel of Matthew. The lineage of Jesus is given in a very specific form, 42 generations. The 41st generation is Jesus, and the 42nd generation is Jesus becoming the Christ. But it's styled very sophisticated. Matthew was an extraordinary, accurate man. He was a Levite. They were always in charge of the temple services. They were not given special land like all the other tribes. But Matthew, as a Levite, was in his time the head of the customs inspecting for the kingdom of Herod Antipas. Judea belonged to his brother, but across the Jordan River was one half of Herod Antipas's empire, and the other half was Galilee. But these little empires were doled out by Augustus Caesar, who always kept other kings from getting hegemony and having traction. So the two parts of Herod Antipas' empire did not touch. In between was a province called Decapolis, the 10 cities. So that there had to be a customs inspection house for anything coming from the Mediterranean into Galilee, and then coming down at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee to a customs inspection to go through a little strip of Decapolis so then it could go into the other half of Herod Antipas's empire, the Transjordan, called Perea in ancient times. Matthew was the head customs inspector at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee for everything coming off the Mediterranean and coming down, especially through the Transjordan, because one usually didn't use, if you were Jewish, if you had a Jewish trade route, you didn't come through Samaria, which was the province just north of Judea that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The Jewish trade routes did not go through Samaria. It was forbidden to them religiously. So they went through Galilee, through the customs house at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, into Decapolis, and from there into the Transjordan. And from there it came across the Jordan and went to Judea, to Jerusalem, to Hebron, to Bethlehem, to Jericho. So Matthew was extremely famous and trustworthy. And if you'll look at the beginning of Matthew, he lays out the 42 generations by saying there are 3 sets of 14. There are 14 generations between Abraham and David, which is a millennium. But the next millennium is split into 2, into half. From David to the exile is 14 generations. From the exile to Jesus is 14 generations. So that what you have is a 2,000-year period, which Matthew shows from Abraham to Jesus is what used to be called in Hermetic wisdom language an aeon, a double millennium. But a millennium is a double 500-year cycle, so that the first millennium, Abraham to David, is 1,000 years, but from David Solomon to Jesus is 2 500-year periods, and they were called cycles of the phoenix. And that style of cycles of the phoenix comes from ancient South Arabia. And South Arabia in ancient times was a kingdom called Saba, and one half was in southern, what is today Yemen. The other half was in Ethiopia. And at the time of a millennium before Jesus, that kingdom of ancient Ethiopia and of Saba, ancient Ethiopia was called Sheba, and it was the queen of Sheba who was the great wise ruler of that kingdom, who got together with Solomon to ask about his wisdom to make sure that he had what is called in alchemy the test of cupellation. And that is, the gold can only be revealed if it goes through a fire test where all of the dross is burnt off either as gas or as ash, absorbed into the crucible, so that the act of cupellation is that everything that can burn off will be gone, and the only thing left will be the button of real gold. The refining fire for wisdom is not a physical fire, but is an inquiry of language and learning to reveal to ourselves the core, the soul essence of who we really are, and that who we really are is shareable in terms of the possibilities of development. So the ancient Hermetic understanding in Jesus' time was that guiding is the essence of the way in which learning takes place. We have seen in our inquiry here that 500 years ago, at the beginning of a cycle of the phoenix, was the beginning of the Renaissance in northern Italy. And it began in northern Italy in Florence because the entire ancient world that had survived all the time in the Byzantine Empire came crashing down to a sudden end with the fall of ancient Constantinople in 1453. We call it today Istanbul. What happened was that the last vestiges of the ancient learning fled from crumbling Constantinople, and an enterprising young banker named Cosimo de' Medici lured them to Florence to have a religious conference, so that for the first time the ancient Byzantine Greek Christianity, the ancient Roman Catholic Christianity would have to meet together and come back into some kind of a whole to meet the challenge The challenge was not just of Islam, but of enormously powerful, talented generals. The man who conquered Constantinople, Mahmud II, was one of the most formidable warriors of all time. And he literally set up new types of cannon that for year after year bombarded the great walls of Constantinople that no one thought would ever be broached. There were 3 sets of them. They were enormous. The Chinese wall is nothing compared to the walls of Constantinople. But Mahmud was like a hammer, keeping constant and penetrating through. And so the fall of Constantinople was the trigger for the Italian Renaissance, where they realized that what had been left out of their tradition constantly were secret writings that owed their origin not to Rome, but to a Greece, an ancient Greece, that owed its wisdom to ancient Egypt. And so it was the wisdom of ancient Egypt that was rediscovered in the Renaissance 500 years ago. And just at the time that it was rediscovered and the translations for the first time were made, and everyone was astounded at this, Columbus discovered America. The great teacher of the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino, completed his great translations in 1492, exactly at the same time that Columbus discovered America. And so the discovery of the New World matched up for anyone who was able to understand that the recovery of ancient wisdom was tied up with the gift from God of a new world. And so the United States of America has a secret tradition that is really Hermetic America, that hidden all this while is something mysteriously that needs to be unfolded, that the original people who came over from Europe did not see, did not understand. And one of the qualities was that the New World was populated. There were Indian tribes everywhere in the Americas. And they had been here since time immemorial. There are 2 major blood types in the Americas, A and AB. And the type in South America has been there for more than 25,000 years. Where Canada and US have a border today, that blood type has been here for at least 12,000 years. But they had learned the wisdom of keeping the landscape completely natural, so that the original people coming from Europe thought it was a wilderness, when actually it was a very sophisticated spiritual landscape. We talked about how in 1840, a book, The Revelations of an ancient Fox Indian shaman named De Kuda, had shown the interpretation of the sacred Indian mounds, and that there weren't just a couple of sacred Indian mounds, but that the entire landscape from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River was tattooed with thousands and tens of thousands of Indian mounds. And they all culminated at the Mississippi River in a great metropolitan Native American Indian city, Cahokia. And if you're in the nicely cleaned up, refurbished ruins and pyramids of Cahokia, one can look across the Mississippi and see St. Louis. And the first thing you see in St. Louis, right across the river, is the big Jefferson Arch. Because through that arch came a new understanding that the landscape itself was the true context teacher, was the guide by which we could relearn something primordial, not only about ourselves on this land, but how we got here. That the sequence of travels, the sequence of the interpenetrations of people, all of this amounted to a great harmonic yet to be discovered. The first two men sent through that area where now the Jefferson Arch is were two captains chosen by Thomas Jefferson, who had just completed a very special deal. He had convinced Napoleon that there is no way that Napoleon's French armies are going to control the Americas. Napoleon had been severely challenged in the Caribbean by Toussaint, and Jefferson sent James Monroe to Napoleon, to Talleyrand, his minister. And he said, we have taken a survey. You have 20,000 men in the New World capable of bearing arms. I am sending 20,000 men a month through the Cumberland Gap. I'm sure we can come to an understanding. And so the Louisiana Purchase, about 3 cents an acre, was concluded, and Lewis and Clark were sent to explore for the first time. They would never have made it had it not been for a Native American woman guide, Sacagawea, who showed them how to move in the landscape in such a way that it would take care for you, it would fortify you, and that all of the tribes that one met in a huge swath, more than 2/3 of the continental United States, for the first time seen. For the first time, the great discovery of where the Mississippi, with its great tributary, the Missouri, went all the way out to western Montana by north of Great Falls, and that there a great watershed, Rocky Mountain watershed, and just on the other side of it was another great river, the Columbia, that went all the way to the Pacific. And so by being able to follow these great rivers and coming to understand that it is the river spinal column origins of civilization that started us in the first place. The Nile River, the Euphrates and Tigris River, the Indus River, the Danube River, wherever one finds the Amazon later on in South America, the Congo in Africa, the Yangtze and the Huanghe, the Yellow River in China, the Mekong, wherever civilizations sprang up, it was because they had a synthesizing great river to tie and unite all of the peoples, all of the groups, all of the tribes, all along enormous stretches of land. The publication of the Dover paperback edition of the Lewis and Clark edition, Expedition, was in 3 volumes. It came out in 1965. This was an extraordinary thing to put it in the hands of ordinary people at a very reasonable price. The original printing of the Lewis and Clark Expedition was put out January 1st, 1814, in an enormous edition that left out all of the scientific material, because the scientific material had been given to a man, William Barton, who did nothing with it, sat on it, and that he died, and the material was not added until 1893. And the reason why it was added finally in 1893 in a great, huge 4-volume set, the 3 volumes of the Dover take the volume of the illustrations and distribute it all the way through the 3 books, so that the 3 books have the complete edition. Why in 1893 would a complete new edition of it be put out, and why in 1965 would a paperback edition of it be put out literally so that it could reach 100,000, several 100,000, finally more than 1 million readers? Why is this? Because in between the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was 1806 to 1808, and the publication then in 1814, in between 1814 and 1893, an enormous challenge and response had happened in the United States. The challenge was the honing of two factions that resulted finally in coalitions that gave us the Civil War. More than 1 million men died in the Civil War. Died. Not just the wounded and maimed, there were several million of those. More Americans died in the Civil War than in World War II. It was catastrophic because the Civil War was the first time a mechanized machine warfare was put into process. Instead of rifles, you had Gatling guns. You had the beginnings of submarines. You had artillery that was extraordinarily accurate and very, very powerful. And to go with that were military operations that were honed to simply shred the enemy, not to scare them, but to shred them. And one of the figures in the Civil War who lost his right arm was a young captain named John Wesley Powell. Powell was an extraordinary, tough, amazing man. And he got together with a number of other men who were saddened by the Civil War, who were maimed in their hearts, who were suffering because the land itself had suffered a searing, blistering 4-year war, and then the assassination of Lincoln ending that entire episode and leaving a suffering that began to fester. In 1869, John Wesley Powell and 9 other men made an expedition to go literally where no man has gone before, and to use that Star Trek phrase is exactly right. They had 4 special boats that were built so that they could be easily portaged. They could carry the 10 men and all the supplies with enough months of supplies so that they could go from the Green River Station in Wyoming down the Green River, which joined the Grand River, which is now part of the Colorado River, and to go where no one had ever gone before, down the Colorado River, and explore the Grand Canyon. And so the exploration of the Colorado River and its canyons was put out in the Dover paperback in 1961. 4 years later, the Lewis and Clark expedition was put out, 1965. We have to look at 1961 to understand why is it that hundreds of thousands of copies of something that was from a little scientific expedition in 1869. In fact, there was a second expedition just 2 years later where Powell, who was an extraordinary captain, even though he had only one arm, he was one of these incredibly brave men, and all of the other men took special care for him. I have to give you an incident. Powell and one of his men, along this precarious trip where the canyon sides were rising to enormous heights. The Grand Canyon is more than a mile deep. That's 500 stories high on both sides. Powell and one of his friends wanted to take a special reading and sextant triangulation. So they saw a special rock called Echo Rock now, where they could get, if they could get up there, they would have a chance to do their scientific reading and So they made their way along very narrow little rock ledges that inclined, and they finally came to the top where Echo Rock was, and it was difficult because there was a sheer precipice drop-off of more than 1,000 feet, about the height of the World Trade Centers in New York. Powell, in order to fasten his equipment, started to lower himself down, and then he realized with just the one hand that his toes were touching the last little crevice where he could get a foothold, but he couldn't pull himself back up. So his friend, absolutely petrified, looking down at the one-armed Captain Powell, he searched to try and find something, and of course there were no sticks or trees or limbs, and they're 1,000 feet above the Colorado River, and there's several thousand feet of cliff above them. So the only thing he could do is he lowered his pants and took off his long john underwear. And he used his long john underwear to dangle down by Powell's face and arms, and he let go of the rope and grabbed the long johns, and his friend pulled him back to the top. Instead of being scared, they went on with their measurements and came back down, he said, by a much easier way. It's this kind of extraordinariness which opened up the most incredible range of landscape that had been seen. There was no place in the world at the time, 1869, that compared to the Grand Canyon. Powell says you could take the entire Blue Ridge mountain range and drop it into the Grand Canyon and watch it disappear. The Blue Ridge in Jefferson's time was the big mountain range to try to get over. It's that part of the Appalachian Mountains that the further west of the new country was going to be. The Grand Canyon dwarfed all of that. This volume, the Colorado River region and John Wesley Powell, was a commemoration in 1969 for that expedition of 1869. The book that came out in 1969 was The Man Who Rediscovered America, John Wesley Powell. These are 1969. Why are they there in 1969? Because in 1969, Americans went to something larger than the Grand Canyon. They went to the moon. And the trigger to going to the moon was set in 1961 by John F. Kennedy, who says in his papers, these are the public papers of the presidents, John F. Kennedy, 1961. And you can find these. They're published by the United States Printing Office. He says in here, the fundamental task of our foreign aid program in the 1960s is not negatively to fight communism. Its fundamental task is to help make a historical demonstration that in the 20th century, as in the 19th, in the southern half of the globe, as in the north, economic growth and political democracy can develop hand in hand. In short, we have not only obligations to fulfill, we have great opportunities to realize. He took the globe not east and west, but north and south. Not the eastern western hemispheres, but the globe turned 90 degrees like a Pythagorean shift, saying the northern part of the globe and the southern part of the globe are one planet. And we must graphically be able to communicate this to everyone on the earth that is one planet. The only place you can get a view of the earth as one planet is from the moon. So we're going to go to the moon. Not just to go to the moon, but to go to the moon to let everyone see this is one planet. It's not a pastiche of different colored maps of political or religious or whatever other concern, that mankind inhabits a place, and that this place is a beacon. From Mars, our planet looks like a sapphire blue star, very much like the star Sirius looks to us, only with a deeper sapphire to the tone. It's a star sapphire. We have a blessed oasis in an enormity that not only shrinks the Grand Canyon, it shrinks planets, it shrinks whole star systems, because it reaches out incredibly. And what we're showing in Hermetic America is the interweaving of constantly not following a line of history, but a spiral that keeps going out and keeps going in, so that we constantly have what I have called the future and the new past. They're a pair. They tune together. We are constantly able to receive a deeper, more precise guidance, a more expanded, fuller possibility of a new range of landscape, so that the precision of the guidance now is down to molecules, down to atoms, down to cells, down to DNA, to the RNA, to the most exquisite, smaller than the small. We are able to measure attoseconds. That's a billionth of a second. We can have a special photographic process to show the movement of an electron as it transmits itself from one atom to another, ionizing it. We also have the ability to see that we're able to chart the entire sky, and this is the National Geographic. And the chart is not just simply of the stars in the sky. This is a chart of the known universe, the known cosmos. 13.7 billion light years. So that we have before us an incredible array that has disclosed itself in only 300 years. Because the original Hermetic American, to be able to look through the various walls, which, as was said in Berlin just a week ago, there are new walls to be crumbled and torn down. We are able to look back and see that Benjamin Franklin understood how to vision and how to see, penetrating through all of the gates that were in the way by a kind of special language that unlocked those gates, and it was called the continuity of the attention to the person, to keep expanding the context in which the ever-refining person was able to be free to inquire, to endeavor, to do things. And so it's little wonder, we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, little wonder that Franklin was the inventor of the bifocals. How to look really close and read the small print, and then how to look up and look really far and see clearly into the future, into the distance. It is this particular quality of Franklin that led him to the great discovery that there is a universal energy called electricity. And he's the first to make a battery, and this is Franklin's battery, 1740s. He's the first to give the nomenclature that we use today for electricity. He literally electrified the world. We're going to take a break and come back. Let's come back and let's tune ourselves to at least two major themes of ancient wisdom which came to an expressive fulcrum an apex, not so much an apex, but it's like an hourglass. It's where the two parts of the hourglass come together. And an hourglass is for measuring time. And one of the two aspects that we need to appreciate is that time is a form, has forms. It's a dimension that has forms. And the reason for this, and it is a reason, that time is the first dimension rather than the fourth. And the first dimension, when time has its concourse, there's a beginning, and before that beginning, there is no beginning. There is only a non-time, superdimensional eternity. So that anything that has existence has it because time has begun. And when time has begun, instantly what blossoms out of time are the three dimensions of space. And the three dimensions of space, because they have a dynamic of time and they have a spatial volume, anything that then emerges within that four-dimensional dynamic volume will have a particular quality to it. It will have a symmetrical polarization. It will have a positive, negative, all the different polarities. And so any existentiality will always be polarized. And the ancient wisdom was that in order to survive the ending of the polarization, one must shift, one must transform the polarization 90 degrees so that it becomes a complementarity rather than a polarity. Because the complementarity is able to go back into eternity and re-emerge. But the re-emergence is not a re-emergence so much as it is a fresh, original emergence just then and there. And so ancient wisdom, culminating in the Hermetica, the late 1st century, early 2nd century AD in Alexandria, was always that one must view time as forms, and one must understand that our spirit person is in a complementarity with eternity and not in a polarity limited to this world. That beyond this world or beyond worlds that exist is a living eternity which is not confined by time nor space. That Hermetic tradition resulted in a series of 13 classic dialogues between the guide, Hermes Trismegistus, and those who were learning with him, learning from him initially because they thought they were students of his, until they came to the point of the transform where instead of there being a student-teacher, it was that both were learning together. And that the learning together was the shift from a polarized world to a complementarity of eternity. And so the ancient wisdom was always at the beginning and at the end. One puts in a sacred hymn. At the end of the first of the Hermetica, there's a hymn. At the end of the 13th of the Hermetica, there's another hymn. The first Hermetic dialogue is called the Poimandres. In Greek, poiesis means to creatively imagine and make like a work of art. or make like a spirit form, which is not pragmatic so much in time, but is prismatic in eternity. And so the spirit person is a prismatic spirit form that has a complementarity with the cosmos. The poiesis becomes applied to the guidance of the mind, and the reading of that first dialogue conveys the sense that what is happening here is that the guide is not only a guide for this student, who is not called a student, not called a disciple, is called a son. So that the lineage is a family lineage, so that one understands that one is learning. Initially, you thought it was from a teacher, but that teacher turns out to be a guide who then shares with you the presence of the eternal, both together. In the Poimandres, Hermes Trismegistus stops his son Tot from speaking further. He's saying, now we must keep our silence for a moment together, because from now on, the language will not be ours so much as it will be divine, and we will both hear and speak that simultaneously together. This is the blessing of the gift of tongues, not in a reductive sense that then they have a glossolalia where they're just speaking in tongues, but they're able to speak language in reality rather than in the polarity of languages that are subsystems of the real word. And so the teacher to men has a point to where the guidance becomes participatory, and the language becomes able to go into a different mode. The polarized language is rhetorical. The complementarity language is poetical. So that the time-honored wisdom understanding was always that a real wisdom teacher is ready to learn with you all over again, freshly, before the beginning. And the way that this is exemplified is that one acquires, each and all, everyone acquires the ability to have a spontaneous, sacred prayer of praise for the divine, which is in a poetic language, not a rhetorical design. The 13th of the Hermetica is called the rebirth. The Poimandres means literally the creative mind shepherd. This is the shepherd who teaches us to the point to where we join with that teacher and we learn together to sing together, so that the singing of hymns, not just in Christianity or in Judaism or in whatever religion, but the singing of hymns together is a celestial choir. When that is joined together, everyone sings together. The most famous Western classic image of this is at the end of Dante's Divine Comedy, at the end of the Paradiso. Dante has had his guides, and Beatrice has been the feminine wisdom guide through the Paradiso, and he is finally brought to that transition where there no longer is a guide, but that he sees that there is a great eagle in heaven whose eye he, looking at, suddenly looks through, and he sees that the entirety of heaven is like the petals of an infinite rose, and that this infinite rose is singing as a choir to God, singing praises. At the end of the rebirth dialogue is another poem, another hymn, And it is the hymn that we have risen together, originally, not just each day, but at any given instance of time in any given volume of space, including all of time, including all of space. So it's a release from the worry that this may not be true. It is truer than true. It is real. The 42 generations that are there in the gospel, according to Matthew, who, as we have seen, is extremely precise. His real name was Levi. His father was named Alphaeus, and he had a brother named James, who is referred to as James the Less because there was another apostle named James, the brother of John. There were two Jameses. Matthew means gift of God. It's an appellation like Peter, Cephas. He's called the Rock. It is a given appellation, and so Matthew is also a given appellation. Jesus gave him the name Matthew because he was that gift of precision. His ancestry had kept track for 42 generations for the 2,000-year period and had never lost a stitch in generations or in time. The quality of the 42 is prefigured 300 years before Abraham, prefigured, in fact, in the very place in which Abraham was born and raised. He is Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees. And Ur is one of the most ancient cities in the civilized world. It's in what is today southern Iraq. One of the peculiarities is that the Hermetic America should be at the very foundings of urban civilization that began about 4,000 BC in that very part of the world. The significance of Ur, though, was transformed about 2300, 2400 BC because the first king of kings in the world came into possession of an empire that included dozens of other kingdoms, so he was a king of kings. His name was Sargon, Sargon of Akkad. And in order to have a language, a poetic hymnal language that was able to have all of the different temple groups sing together to the same divinity, he had a brilliant daughter named Enneduanna. You can look her up on the net. There are several websites now devoted to her. Enneduanna wrote all of the epics of Inanna. And those have been translated several times. And I've done presentations on these for decades. Those different temples, when you counted them, amounted to 42 separate God temple priesthoods in the ancient Sumerian Akkadian field. And so she went to each of those 42 temples and wrote a special transformed hymn for each of those 42, and those 42 temple hymns are the way in which the original Semitic language of praising through hymns came into flourishing. She's the first great literary artist in history whose name and whose background we know. 2,300 years later, there was another spiritual, poetic genius, and her name was Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene composed 42 hymns to the harmonic way in which Solomon's wisdom had come 1,000 years later to a fruition in Jesus. And they were called the Odes to Solomon. There are 42 of them. And they're all about the transform that happens for someone coming into tune with first the teacher, Jesus, and then the turning of that. In Greek, the turning is called a metanoia. It means above the mind, that the mind will have a certain structure. It will have a symbolic structure. But if it is rotated 90 degrees, that symbolic structure now has a different quality. It has not just the structure with its projections, its linearities, its perspective, but it will now have a rotational quality to it. It will have what is called angular momentum as well, so it will be a spiral teaching. And it is that spiral teaching that gives us things like galactic structures. That there is a quality of like a pinwheel rainbow. Mark Chagall did a very famous Hasidic visionary painting of the creation of man one time. And it had the great angel carrying the body of Adam ready to receive the divine breath. And there's a rainbow pinwheel behind the angel, bringing Adam to the place to where he can receive the pneuma, the divine breath, the way in which Hesed will enliven and give the ability not only to breathe, but to breathe as a very special being, to breathe with the divine breath that doesn't ever stop. Once you can breathe that way, you can breathe that way eternally. And one of the things that comes out of that way of breathing is the ability to praise God in reality, originally, spontaneously, at any time, in any space, worlds without end. We talked about in the Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene series that Mary Magdalene then taught. She was the receiver of a brilliant, talented, beloved young man who became St. John from the cross. And it's mistranslated and most emended and tampered with New Testaments. But the saying from the cross, Jesus said to her, "Behold your son." And to young John, "Behold your mother." In other words, the adoption was made by Jesus. John at the time was 12 years old. And in the Jewish tradition, when you're 12, you receive instruction for your bar mitzvah at 13 to join the community of the mature. He was taken with Mary Magdalene and a number of other people to Ephesus. And two of the people that went with them were two of the brothers of Jesus, who, like their father Joseph, were, quote, carpenters, but they were not just carpenters, they were builders. And they built this house called the House of the Nightingales on a ridge which was overlooking the great metropolis. Ephesus at the time was one of the largest cities in the world. It was about 400,000 people. This house has been reconstructed exactly the way in which it was anciently built by the two brothers were named Simon and Joseph, who were great builders, and they, along with the young John and two other apostles, Philip and Nathaniel, often called Bartholomew, built this house for Mary Magdalene to not only raise St. John and to bring him up so that he was able to use a special spiritual poetic language, but also to take care of the mother Mary, who was 63 at the time and lived a few more years in this house. Inside this house is one of the early chapels. In Greek, it's called a monasterium. And these chapels in this kind of a house were characteristic on the outskirts of Alexandria in the community of the spirit healers, the therapeutai. This house was visited last year by Pope Benedict XVI, who went out of his way to go and pay homage there. The international press did not cover it very much, but he went there because the Vatican knows full well what this is. Unfortunately, a great deal of the rest of it is left in ruins. The greatest early church in Christianity was St. John's Basilica in Ephesus, and it has been in ruins for 1,000 years. His tomb had to be cleaned out of refuse and iron gates put over it so that vandals would not go in and desecrate it with urine and so forth. Most of the original pre-Christian Great Way sites are still in ruins. One of the qualities in Hermetic America is to understand that we're not looking at metaphysical, symbolic forms. These are medieval in their nature and in their projectiveness, and they have nothing to do with the true kinds of arts and sciences that the Hermetic tradition constantly teaches. An astronomy that does not become an astrology, but becomes a cosmology. An alchemy that is not about manipulation by some kind of magic, but about transforms that have an ancient magi quality of being able to further transform. And those two are linked. The world of the chemical, biological, biochemical, very small, and the world of the astronomical, astrophysical cosmos are linked into a tunable pair by love of wisdom, by philosophy. And that the carrier of philosophy is to take time forms out of their linearity and to put them into the spirals of history, because history is not a mythology. It's not limited to the parentheses of existential things and mental things. History is living. It can be revisited and renewed, and so there's such a thing as the new past, constantly available. And part of the new past is exemplified here. This top photo is of the great lens of Mount Palomar's telescope here in California that was finished by 1948. And in the focus of it, in this white square, is Sir Isaac Newton's telescope. So that the telescope from 300 years before hardly even covers the center of the eyepiece. And now, of course, we have telescopes that dwarf Mount Palomar. Palomar's telescope, when it was first made, was so huge when it was finished in 1948. And it was finished by another Hermetic American. We've talked about him in the previous series in Hermetic America, George Ellery Hale. And Hale's first big telescope was up here on Mount Wilson, just above Pasadena, Los Angeles. This is a telescope before the Mount Palomar telescope, the Yerkes telescope built in southern Wisconsin, associated because it was a telescope of the University of Chicago. And Einstein and Hubble are here together at the Yerkes Observatory in 1921. So when we look at the way in which astronomy and cosmology have blossomed, the alchemy of biochemistry and molecular genetics have blossomed, what has been lacking is the deep wisdom, the Hermetic wisdom of the philosophy that brings them together so that they are not only tunable, but they form a kind of an infinity sign, rainbow continuity, and that's the symbol that we use. One of the really profound qualities of Hermetic America is the ability for those who, in traditions, would be individuals, to understand that they're part of a spiral lineaging that spirals out and spirals in, and to participate spontaneously in being a part of that spirit family. That is not a lineage of tradition, it is a family of resonance. And what results from this is not a kingdom. What results from this is a spectrum. And it is the expansion of the spectrum to include more and more possibilities that gives the harmonic its glory. It is one of the great Hermetic American poets, which we'll get to next week, Walt Whitman, in 1875, right at the time when the first printings of the books of John Wesley Powell on exploring the Colorado, Walt Whitman came out with a Hermetic American book called Democratic Vistas. And he says in there, Mother Nature exemplifies again and again that what she favors is freedom and variety. That human beings exemplify the rainbow covenant of many rainbows, because that one rainbow is like a scale, an octave, but you can have instruments like a piano that have 11 octaves on it, and now you can make a fantastic music. You're not limited to an octave of 8 notes. Now you have a range of notes. And there are many different kinds of instruments, many kinds of scalars that can be used. All of this makes music. John Wesley Powell, in one of his diary notes, says it is conspicuous that the Grand Canyon has moments of incredible inner silence, but that the canyon itself is never silent. You have 10,000 gorges, each one has its own creek, waterfalls. You have the mighty Colorado River with its rapids and its gurglings and rushings. He says the entire canyon sings all the time, has sung for tens of millions of years, and we were the first human beings, because there are many, many long spots that the Indians never went to. He said we were the first to be able to open up and hear the Grand Canyon's permanent choir to the divinity of God in terms of the most fantastic landscape on earth. We now know, because of Hermetic Americans not only going to the moon, but sending resonances out to other planets, that there are enormous places of landscape. The Valle Marineris on Mars is about 10 times the size of the Grand Canyon. We know that there are possibilities beyond belief of moons, of planets, of stars, star systems. When you look tonight at the constellation of Orion, that top left yellow star has an Arabic name because most of the stars were first charted by Arab Hermeticists. Its name is Betelgeuse. And Betelgeuse is so large that if it were where our sun was, its surface would be out at the orbit of Mars. Our scales of pedestrian insistence that we already know and do not have to learn, and that knowing is portioned out and not shared, is from a time form that is over, and over not just once, but every sub-unit of the big time form, of the aeon, to the millennial time forms within it, to the cycles of the phoenix within it, to the cycles of the jubilees of 50 years, 10 times 50 is 500. Each jubilee is 7 times 7 plus a culminating 1, giving a 50. And that each Sabbath, that all of these time forms ended in 1991, and that we have been in the exploration of the new time forms, and that all of them are gaining finally enough audibility to be able to hear the fantastic piano that a new Jerusalem would play. In the book of Revelations, if you'll look at chapter 21, St. John, old at the time, he was in his late 70s. He was exiled to the Isle of Patmos by the Roman Emperor Domitian, who had sent for St. John to be brought to Rome, to be punished, and to be shown that the Roman emperors are in charge of the empire. He could not intimidate St. John, nor could he harm him physically. They tried. And Domitian got scared in ways that world empire leaders get scared. They found that they could do nothing whatsoever to him because he wasn't limited to what they have range of control over. So he was exiled to the worst place Domitian could think of, that is to an island shaped like a ship, Patmos, so that he would be exiled to a stone ship that could not go anywhere. And that's where St. John wrote the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. And he says in chapter 21, I saw that there was a new earth and a new heaven and a new Jerusalem coming down from man. One last little Hermetic tidbit, and then we'll come back next week and continue this. If you look at the Gospel according to Matthew, it's 4 sets of 7. It's 28 chapters. If you will read the beginning of chapter 1, if you read the beginning of chapter 8, of chapter 15, of chapter coming to the end, 22. If you'll read those, you will get a précis of the 4 sevens of the Gospel of Matthew. If you read the Gospel of John, you'll notice there are 21 chapters. So if you read the beginning of 1, the beginning of 8, the beginning of 15, you'll see that those 3 sets of 7 fit together with the 4 sets of Matthew and make an entire 7 times 7, 49 special, and the jubilee of those is the Gospel of the Apocalypse. The book of Revelation is the final. And you'll notice that there are 22 chapters, so that it not only is like an 50th, but that 50 also has an ancient Apollonian quality of the 9 muses made into a harmonic set by Apollo, which is like a 10. And the original tarot decks did not have the major arcana of 21 plus the 0 and the 4 suits. The original tarot decks had 50 cards, 5 sets of 10. And the first set of 10 are the 9 muses and Apollo coming together to make a 10. So that if you look at the 3 sevens of the book of Revelation and the 7 sevens of the Gospels of Matthew and John together, you get then a series of 10. And the 22nd chapter of the book of Revelation is the spark of a new time form, new worlds without end. More next week.